All right, everyone, welcome back to our fifth annual DaoistGate conference, Taoism, Divination, and the Healing Arts. Our next speaker was a practitioner of East Asian medicine, where he lives in New Jersey, and an author of two books, Practical Atlas of Tung Acupuncture and Pricking the Vessels, Bloodletting Therapy in Chinese Medicine. He travels worldwide, teaching and lecturing on different aspects of Chinese medicine, and teaches at several acupuncture schools. Dr. Henry McCann is a bit of an archetype of the classical Chinese gentleman, if you will, that is skilled at several different arts and is at the same time a lineage holder of several different styles of Chen style Taiji Chuan and Baguazhang, as well as Neigong practice, originating with the legendary Taoist Chan Tuan, who was mentioned in Louis Kamyathi's talk. If you want to go back, if you are watching this on YouTube, for example, you can pull that up because there's some crossover here. These arts are based in many ways on the same philosophies and are using similar terminology as well, and can give the practitioner a greater understanding of the classical Chinese culture from which they came. I personally found his bloodletting book to be a really useful reference in the clinic, and the only reason why I haven't picked up the Tung Acupuncture book is because I've always felt it was a bit of a different world. However, the system is actually a lot more rooted in resonance, according to some of the theories of Bagua, Yin Yang, that we've talked about in this conference that are ever present in Chinese medicine. And coming to that from that understanding of connectedness and correspondence, Dr. Henry McCann is going to enlighten us on the ins, outs, and root of tongue style acupuncture. I'll turn it over to you, Henry. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the very warm welcome. It's a real pleasure to be with everyone today, and it's great to see so many people here online. It's very heartening. A couple of caveats before we start. First of all, I am unlike many of the. I'm very humbled by many of the speakers on the list that you all have for this weekend. Many are people who I've read for years and admire greatly as scholars in the field. I am not a scholar in the field of Taoism. My path was to practice medicine, which I've done for the last 25 plus years or so. And hopefully what I'd like to express today is my understanding, and limited understanding at best, of the expression of many of these very profound principles. For me, that become very practical in terms of how do I deal with patients coming to see me on a very daily basis. So, these are not just principles that are very interesting or, they sound great philosophically, but they're principles rooted in a very sort of profound way that the universe is ordered. And as such, it can be very, very useful on a very practical level, right? I will also let you all know in advance that I cohabitate with a very large guardian breed dog who will invariably bark at something during the presentation. So if you hear something in the background, that's what that is. Not to be alarmed. He's in another room, but every time another dog or, God forbid, a baby carriage walks in front of the house, we will be notified. So if you hear that in the background, my apologies in advance. So I also do understand that many people here, so certainly there are many people here who have a background in studies of Taoism, traditional Chinese culture, theories such as Yin Yang and Wuxing, the five phases. And many of you are scholars in the field. I do know that there are quite a number of people here who are practitioners of Chinese medicine or who are well versed within that field as well. So what I'm going to try to do is straddle both worlds. We're making the presentation not so technical that people who are not practicing physicians can understand it, but hopefully technical enough that people who do practice acupuncture or Chinese medicine can get some sort of appreciation of the material on a slightly different level as well. As we go through this, if there are questions, feel free to throw them out there. I'll try to answer them as best I can. And then I'll leave a little bit of time at the end for some question and answer if people have it. All right, so let me get the presentation up. Okay, so we're going to be talking about the specific lineage of acupuncture, and not to go into too much depth, this is a family style of acupuncture that became prominent or became widely known really starting from in its earliest spread beyond the family in the late 1960s through the early 1970s. The person who is not the founder of the system, but who is credited with teaching it to the general public at large for the first time, is this person who we see here. His name is, we affectionately call him Master Tung. So just as an aside, the romanization here that you see on the screen is the Wade-Giles romanization, and even though the rest of my presentation will be in Pinyin romanization, I use the Wade-Giles here because that's the spelling he's more commonly known by, and the one that he himself chose for most of his presentation when he was still alive. So Master Tung was born in mainland China in Shandong province. I believe it was 1916. So it was during the time period of the beginning of the Republic of China. He was certainly that time period, most of you know the basic history, was particularly tumultuous in China. This was the beginning of the decade or two leading into what would eventually become the Japanese incursion into northern China, and then we have World War II and then the aftermath of that. Master Tung did serve in the Kuomintang military, so he was on the Republican side in the military when he was a young man. He learned acupuncture at the side of his father growing up. He had no real formal education, which is one of the things that kept him from getting a formal license once he did move to Taiwan after the war. So after serving in the Republican military in the basically late 1930s through the 1940s, 1949, with many people, he goes to Taiwan. He stays enlisted in the military probably until the early 1960s or so, at which time he leaves and he starts his own clinic in Taipei. He became particularly well known as an acupuncturist in Taiwan, and in the late 1960s started having materials written about his acupuncture system. First, a set of handwritten or hand-typed notes that were given to students of his, and then later on some texts. So what began initially as one of these secret family traditions that, according to the Dong family, goes back to the Han Dynasty, who really knows because it's one of those secret family traditions, becomes eventually taught to a small number of people in Taiwan, and then it from those students gets spread out throughout the world. So I don't really want to go into too much of a real history beyond that because we don't really have time for it today. But what is interesting is some of the characteristics of Dong's acupuncture is probably the most obvious is it uses a set of acupuncture points that are in many ways distinct from the normal, conventional TCM, whatever we want to call them, acupuncture points that those of us who are acupuncturists have learned throughout the course of our professional education. The other thing that's particularly characteristic of Dong's acupuncture is it is characterized by an almost exclusive use of distant point needling, which means that the needles do not necessarily go into the site of disease, but rather we use areas outside of the site of disease to treat the area of pain, dysfunction, whatever it happens to be. And it's precisely this application of distant point needling that in many ways is the most obvious manifestation of how Dong's acupuncture utilizes these core theories that I know you've all been talking about for the weekend, how they use it in a very practical way in the clinic. And that's what we're going to explore in a bit. One of the other characteristics of the system is a use of a very small number of needles. So the case I'm presenting today, it was a 3-needle treatment, which is a relatively small number of needles. I tend not to get down to that most of the time in the clinic, but the students who sat with Master Dong in Taiwan when he was there report back that he rarely used more than 6 needles in a single treatment. And that's not 6 acupuncture points needled bilaterally, that's cheating, that's 12 needles. So it was very much a very simple and targeted, simple in terms of application, but not in terms of theory, approach to acupuncture. There are also other things that are characteristic of the system, such as a heavy use of bloodletting therapy, certain types of needle strategies, but again, those are not going to have necessarily time to go into too much depth today. So what I thought we would do to start as a jumping off point is present a short case study that is relatively recent in my clinic. I like to try to present recent case studies when I talk about the system. and then go into more of a theoretical understanding of why we're looking at what we're looking at, and then come back to that case study to analyze it a little bit further. So first, just the description of the case study, so you have an idea of what this person came in with. This is a relatively easy case study, a pain management case study. Since we only have an hour to talk, a relatively simple case is a good place as an introduction rather than going into something that's much more complicated. So here we have a 60-year-old female presenting with a recent acute pain and swelling of the left elbow. So it's really the elbow and the forearm she was complaining of. It was definitely visibly swollen. It was hot to the touch. She had seen some other physician, or I don't remember if it was a physician, I have to go back and look at the chart now, physician or physical therapist, who suggested it might be diagnosable as tennis elbow. But for those of you who practice some sort of medicine out here, we tested with resisted extension of the wrist, and there was really no pain. So I don't think the diagnosis of tennis elbow lateral epicondylitis was really appropriate. What was interesting, though, is that she had previously, a few years ago, had a fracture of the proximal ulna, so this bone here in the arm, and it was a bad enough fracture that she had a surgical, there was a plate that was placed surgically, and you could see the surgical scar sort of along that line, mostly of the small intestine channel, which we'll come back to when we go back and look at the case in more sort of technical detail. So again, there was visible swelling and some, it wasn't really red, but there was hot to the touch. And the patient had this constant sense of stiffness, dull, aching pain that was particularly bothersome for her. Okay, that's the case that we're going to eventually analyze. And so before we do that, what I'd like to do is talk about some of the theory that, in my opinion, honestly underpins Chinese medicine as a whole. So I will tell you what I tell most of the people when I talk about Tung's acupuncture, that I don't think Tung's acupuncture is something separate from, in other words, completely different from all other acupuncture systems. I know we like to sometimes say that when we teach Tung's acupuncture because it's a good advertising, but the truth is that Tung's acupuncture, like all acupuncture, like meditation, like Qigong, like internal cultivation practices, they're all based on a set of similar core principles that underlie Chinese philosophy, Taoism, all of this. So if it is underlied by these core philosophies, then it works, right? That's my opinion. If it's just sort of random, we stick a needle here and something happens, for me, that's not so interesting. What I like to see is, how is this approach to acupuncture manifesting these core principles that essentially the universe is built on? So let's take a look at some of those basic ideas. So first, what's particularly interesting is that I do believe, and I think most of us know, that there has been significant cross-pollination between various different types of religious traditions, philosophical traditions. I don't want to go into the debate between religion versus philosophy. Both words, I think, are inadequate and particularly based on Western categories of how things are. But for example, Taoism in China and the precursors of Taoism in China are based on many of the same concepts that have influenced medicine, and then medicine has gone back to influence these other types of cultivational systems throughout the last few millennia. So what I'm going to give you here first is a series of quotations just to help illustrate this. This first one here is from, when you see the word LS, this is from the Lingshu. The Lingshu is one of the early classical texts of Chinese medicine that date back to about the Han Dynasty. So the Lingshu is the miraculous pivot or numinous pivot. It's one part of the corpus that we, in combination, call the Yellow Emperor's Classic of Internal Medicine, the Huangdi Neijing. So here we have a quote. It says, "Heaven is round, the earth is rectangular. Man's head are round, and their feet are, humans' heads are round, and their feet are rectangular. And thus they are in resonance." And this idea of resonance and connection is what I'm going to try, the theme I'm going to try to explain first from the theoretical perspective, and then how does it actually work in the clinic through the rest of the talk. Heaven has sun and moon, humans have two eyes, which is why, for example, in the Neijing 2, the diagram of the internal landscape that I have a little picture of, and I saw on someone's screen early. We see the sun on the left and the moon on the right in terms of the eyes. So heaven has sun and moon, humans have 2 eyes. The earth has 9 regions, humans have 9 orifices. Heaven has wind and rain, humans have joy and anger. Heaven has thunder and lightning, humans have the sound of the voice. Heaven has 4 seasons, humans have the 4 limbs. These are the correspondences, the resonances, however we want to sort of translate this term, of humans to heaven and earth. Right, and for those of you who read the Chinese, I gave you the original Chinese quotation here. And the word that on your screen is highlighted in blue is one of the words that's going to be the core message of our time today together. So this character here is Ying. What we have here is the definition of this character from the Shuanjiezi. For those of you who know the Shuanjiezi is, I won't have to go into detail. For those of you who don't, just know that it's a sort of a concordance of terms, or for simply put, a dictionary of Chinese language that dates back about 2,000 or so years. So this word Ying here, the definition is to act as, to match equally. So this is a type of correspondence, a type of resonance. So for example, in the Neijing Suen, the simple questions section of the Yellow Emperor's Classic, it says in the second chapter is the chapter on how do we do seasonal harmonization as a way of looking for health. In the spring, for example, we're supposed to get up early, go outside, walk around, don't be angry, let your spirit just sort of flow and move. That's a paraphrase. I don't remember the exact quote in my head, but that's the paraphrase. And then it says, when we do this, we are in a state of this character of Ying, with the movement of birth, with movement of Sheng, which is the movement of springtime. And therefore we can have a state of health. So this is the idea that we have a resonance with something. We have a connection, not necessarily connection, we'll get to connection soon, but we have a resonance with some other movement. And this really becomes the basis of, in my opinion, how all medicine works. Those of you who are more experts in other things Taoist, you can explain how this explains that aspect of it as well. Now, from the Lei Jing, another text written by Zhang Jiebing, this is a commentary to this line. So the line, these are the correspondences of humans to heaven and earth. What Zhang Jiebing says is that is to say a human's body is a small heaven and earth, 小天地. This particular statement here, I think, is incredibly profound and really at the heart of how we sort of treat with acupuncture, with herbs, with whatever it happens to be. And what all of this is an expression of the idea that there is an intimate connection, a very real intimate connection between the macrocosm and the microcosm, where they reflect one another. We see this throughout all of sort of Chinese thought. For example, the state, the government in ancient China mirrors or mirrored the ordering of heaven. Right? So we see that the description of the deities are very much a celestial bureaucracy that mimics the human bureaucracy that we have here. Within the ritual space, for example, the Taoist ritual space, the altar also corresponds to the heavens, to the cosmos. Likewise, the human body is also a microcosm. Here, Zhang says that the human body is a small heaven and earth. In other words, the human body is a microcosm of the natural world. Let's see, I'm going to go back. Which is why we have these quotes that go in detail to describe how the human body is in many ways a mirror of the natural environment around us. The reason in Chinese medicine we have yin yang and 5 phases in my body is because we have yin yang and 5 phases in the natural world, and the human body is in this state of a mirror image of all of creation. Interestingly, the human body is also a microcosm of the state bureaucracy. In the 8th chapter of the Suen, which is the treatise on the secret canons from the Numinous Orchid, one of the best chapter titles in all of the Yellow Emperor's Classic, in my opinion. This chapter tells us, for example, the heart is the enlightened sovereign. The lung functions as the minister of state, the liver as the general, etc. So it goes on to describe all of the internal organs as the bureaucracy of the state manifest within the body. So all of these correspondences are seen in a very real way within the body. Now, what I find particularly interesting is that ritual, for example, in the Taoist sense or the religious sense, and not necessarily only the Taoist sense, is something that reestablishes or reconfirms that connection between humans and the celestial bureaucracy, heaven, gods, etc. Being out of harmony with the celestial bureaucracy, with heaven, is what leads to calamity, to suffering, to all sorts of ailments, all sorts of problems. Likewise, when the human body is out of harmony with either the natural world or out of harmony with itself, where all of the interconnected pieces are not in a state of proper working. For example, in that chapter I mentioned before, the Suen chapter 8, the chapter that describes the body as the bureaucracy, it essentially says that we have this bureaucracy. The problem is when one of the organs, one of the ministers of state is not doing their job, then the entire system starts to suffer. In particular, in that chapter, when the heart, as the sovereign, doesn't do its job properly, then everything under heaven becomes a problem. In other words, in the body, the whole system sort of falls apart. So when the body is out of harmony with either the natural world or the body is not acting as an interconnected whole, in other words, in the medical sense, the balance of the channels, the organs, the tissues, etc., when that's disrupted, then we have disease or dysfunction. In a sense, then, in my opinion, acupuncture is one way, almost like a ritual practice, the ritual of reestablishing the relationship between humanity and the cosmos. Acupuncture is the body ritual of reestablishing that harmony between channels, between organs, so as to establish the state of imaging and of connection that reestablishes health. Does everyone get that basic idea? That's the premise we're essentially working on here. Okay, so this, for example, is a diagram I'm sure you're all very familiar with. This is from the White Cloud Temple in Beijing. This is the diagram of the internal landscape where the whole body is imaged as if it is really the celestial everything, right? So everything is contained within the entire body, right? So something, it's too small for me to read off the top. So there's like one of these top lines up here says something like the entire world is encapsulated in a single grain, right? So everything in the large sense is seen in the small sense. Here we have this quote. This is from the 74th chapter of the Suen. And it says, and in my opinion, this is one of the most important quotes that we see in the entire Neijing corpus. It says, "Heaven and earth are the great principle. A human's Shen spirit penetrates and reflects it." Right? And that, so those two characters I gave you in blue there, the first one is Tung. This is a state of sort of interconnection with something. Even in Chinese medicine, we use this word to describe sort of an interconnected and free-flowing state of the channels. So there's a saying in Chinese medicine that says, "Bu tong zi tong." It's a play on words, of course. When there's not a state of this tong, then we have tong, pain as a result. And this tong can be within the body. In other words, the channels can be interconnected and free-flowing. or it can be a state of Tung connection, right? Penetration with the natural world around us. So when my body is not in a movement that represents winter, and it is a movement of winter outside, then that could potentially lead to a state of disease. The second character there is the one we've been talking about, which is this reflection or in resonance with. So not only is my body, for example, here with heaven and earth, not only am I connected to heaven and earth, all of us are, but we're also, as we saw before, a small heaven and earth. We are this reflection of heaven and earth. Likewise, in the body, we can have all the different parts of the body being connected to one another, which I think most people who practice Chinese medicine understand and talk about quite a bit. But the second part is that all parts of the body are also this aspect of being in resonance or being small mirror images of as well. And that's the part of Chinese medicine that I think is sometimes missed and that Dong's acupuncture particularly is good at illustrating. So let's get more into that. So what we're talking about, this idea of humans are a microcosm, or I'll put it as a more modern term, a hologram of the natural world. This is one of the expressions of heaven, earth, and humanity are in harmony. And one of the ways this is manifest is that if we believe, right, and this is where sometimes, the theory is not just theory. If we believe that we are this microsystem of the natural world, then we can take that connection between the macrocosm and the microcosm and shrink it down, shrink it down, shrink it down, shrink it down, so that as a true hologram, if we cut a hologram in half and keep cutting it in half and keep cutting it in half, we can see that every small piece continues to mirror and reflect the whole. That becomes the basis for which we then use to adroitly apply the needle when we're looking at acupuncture. So just like my body has the universe in it, every small part of my body also is a mirror of the whole body and the universe. For example, those of you who practice acupuncture hopefully remember that on every one of the channels, we have a series of acupuncture points that are called Jing, Ying, Shu, Jing, He. So we have these 5 points that sort of mirror or mimic this movement of water going from something superficial to something more deep. Each of those 5 points represents one of the 5 phases. So on every channel, we have wood, fire, soil, metal, water. So every channel does have a connection to the whole through this idea of the 5 phases. And because of that, every channel is a window or mirror into that. How can I work with the body as a whole? And how does the body have this connection to the outside world? Get the idea? Even down to each individual acupuncture point. Each individual acupuncture point is a mirror or microcosm of the entire system. And this idea can also be exploited. So the same acupuncture point, needled differently, or in combination with other acupuncture points, can have vastly different functions. Okay. Now, the other thing I mentioned before is that Dong's acupuncture is characterized by this distant needling. So we needle away from the site of disease. So here's some quotes that discuss that briefly. Hence, those who know well how to use the needles, basically the acupuncturists really is good at doing acupuncture. From yin, they pull the yang. From yang, they pull the yin. With the right, they treat the left, and with the left, they treat the right. So this ideal of being able to treat the body without simply needling into the site of disease, we see in the earliest, sort of most foundational texts of the medicine. Here's another quote. When the disease is above, remove from below. When the disease is below, remove from on high, remove from above. When the disease is in the head, remove from the feet. When the disease is in the low back, remove from the hollow of the knee. Okay. And again, I will argue that this is present in all of acupuncture practice, not only the Dong lineage of acupuncture. Okay, let's move back from the realm of theory now and explore how this is actually addressed on a day-to-day basis in the clinic. So let's return to the case that we started with. So again, we have this female patient. She has pain, discomfort, feels hot to the touch on this part of the arm. It was on her left arm. So the first thing that we want to try to do is identify the location of disease. So most of you probably know that in Chinese medicine, even if you don't practice Chinese medicine, there are these things called channels, meridians, whichever term you want to use to translate these structures. Each of the main 12 channels is associated with an internal organ. However, each of these main channels is also given a name that describes if it's yin or yang and what aspect of yin and yang it manifests. So here, based on the location of disease, on looking and palpating the person's arm, we diagnosed that there was the channels that were diseased were first the yang ming, which is the large intestine channel, the arm yang ming, and the taiyang, which is the small intestine, the arm taiyang, small intestine channels. And there was stagnation and heat located in those channels. From whatever reason, to some extent, the etiology matters less because what I have is just the patient in front of me at the moment they're in my clinic. So the question then becomes, when we're needling away from the site of disease, how do we treat that local area? What area of the body can I apply the needle to that has a resonance with the area of pain or dysfunction? That becomes the next question. So one of the other quotes that I'll give you here, to jump briefly back into the realm of philosophy, this is a commentary to one of the lines in the of the Qiangua. These are a commentary to the lines of the hexagrams from the I Ching. So this is from the commentary from hexagram number 1, the Tian or heaven hexagram, all yang lines. It says, 9 in the 5th place, the dragon soars in the sky. It will be advantageous to see the great person. What does that mean? The master said, notes of the same key respond to one another, and the same chi mutually seeks. Water flows towards the place that is low and damp. Fire rises up towards what is dry. Clouds follow the dragon, and the winds follow the tiger. The sage makes an appearance, and you can read the rest of the quote. The important piece here is this idea of Tung qi xiang qiu. The same qi looks for itself, right? In common parlance, this is sort of like the English phrase, birds of a feather. So I tell my students that a lot of acupuncture is the birds of a feather principle of medicine. So what does this mean? This comes to the very important concept of gan ying, this idea of connection and resonance. In other words, things of the same category, the same lei, the category, they have an influence, they have a connection, a resonance with, and an influence over one another. And in the Chinese context, this is often expressed through theories such as yin yang and 5 phases. For example, in my body, we have organs based on 5 phases that have a connection and resonance with other parts of the body. For example, the liver and the eyes have a resonance. Because of that same theory in the natural world, the springtime, the direction of east, right? These things go with the wood, and because the liver also pertains to wood, the liver pertains to that color, that direction, that time of year, that temperature, whatever it happens to be. Okay? So for example, in certain types of modern Qigong practices, we will do breathing in of different colored lights because certain colors resonate with the different organs. Or we may practice Qigong, for example, in different directions at different times of the day or different times of the year, so as to allow the body to better resonate with the natural world. So this idea of connection and resonance, things of the same category respond to one another. So in medicine then, if I'm not applying the needle directly to the site of disease, I have to decide where in the body can I apply the needle that has this Gan-ing, this resonance, so that I can get a response. Gan-ing also means sort of like stimulus response idea. So the first question we have to ask ourselves is, so we have two things we already know. We already know a number of things we already know. We'll get to the two most obvious things. First, in this case, the patient has a disease or dysfunction of this part of the body. In other words, near the elbow and just distal to the elbow, just down from the elbow. The other thing we know that we looked at in terms of the diagnosis is that we're looking at the large intestine, which is the yang ming, the yang brilliance channel of the arm, and the small intestine, which is the tai yang, the greater yang channel of the arm. So we know the channels that are affected, we know the part of the body is that affected. Now we have to choose what areas of the body have a specific resonance, which areas of the body are, in other words, a microsystem of that part of the body, so that we can get effective treatment to that area of disease or dysfunction. So one of the ways we do this is we look at how the different parts of the body have a relationship to one another. This is one way. There are actually numerous ways of doing this, but this is one fairly obvious way of doing this that, as an aside, is also deeply connected to things like the practice of internal martial arts. For example, those of you who practice internal martial arts, whether it's Xingyi Quan, Taiji Chuan, or Baguazhang, probably have heard of the idea of the 6 harmonies, the liuhe. The 6 harmonies in martial arts are divided between 3 external harmonies, right? The san waihe, and the 3 internal harmonies, the san neihe. The 3 external harmonies are the hand harmonizes with the foot, the elbow with the knee, and the shoulder with the quad, with the hip, right? So this describes the body as an interconnected whole and describes resonant structures of the body being related, connected, right? They have an influence over one another. In martial arts, this is one of the ways we describe how we move the body as a whole unit, how we use the body for attack and defense, etc. In medicine, this is a way that we can understand resonant structures of the body so as to be able to treat areas of pain or dysfunction. For example, if we know that the hand and the foot have a resonance with one another, if we have then a problem of the foot, I can apply a needle to the hand, and by stimulating the movement of qi and blood in the hand, we can get a resonant movement of qi and blood in the foot. Just like when the weather becomes cold, when we're moving into winter, which we'll be doing in about another month or so. When the weather changes, my body, there's a change in my body also at the same time, right? And I need to be able to understand that in order to stay in a state of health or disease, okay? So outside, the natural world is this stimulus, the needle that my body then responds to. In the microcosm of just the human body, I can apply the needle to one part of the body, and because of this idea of Gan-ing, this sort of stimulus and response, we can get a concurrent movement of qi and blood in other parts of the body. Does everyone get that idea? We can also, for those of you who want to get a little more deeply into the theoretical woods here, we can invert the orientations, and instead of using the hand to treat the foot, which we see here, right? So here the hand and the foot are the same level. We can also use the shoulder to treat the foot because yin and yang are mutually intertwined, they transform into one another, and instead of using this becomes a little too more theoretical, so those of you who don't practice Chinese medicine, indulge me for just a second. In Chinese medicine, we understand distal is yang, proximal is yin, right? So hand is more yang compared to shoulder, foot is more yang compared to hip. If we use hand and foot to treat one another, it's 2 yang structures. But because yin and yang are mutually intertwined, we can use yin parts of the body to also treat yang parts of the body. So this becomes a very flexible way of choosing areas of the body that have all sorts of different connections to other areas of the body. Okay? So one of the things we know then is that if she has, back to the case, if she had problem here on the arm, just down from the elbow, one of the options we have for treatment is around just the same space on the knee, just down from the knee. Get the idea? Right? Because that structure represents the other part of the body. It has an imaging of, it is in a state of connection and resonance with. Then we have to understand how can we potentially treat the channels. So one of the ways we can treat the channels is by looking at the same qi. Remember we said the same qi looks for itself. This is the Tung Qi Xiangqiu principle that we looked at before. So if we know the area of problem is on the yang brilliance or the greater yang, right, those channels that have that resonance of qi, that aspect of qi, then we can choose those same levels of channel or same types of channel on the other limb that we're going to needle. So if the problem here is on the yang brilliance channel, we can choose another yang brilliance channel because they're intertwined and connected. If the problem here is on the greater yang channel, then we can choose the greater yang channel by the knee in order to treat that problem of the elbow. So get this idea so far? Now notice, here we also have yang treating yang and yin treating yin. But what we saw in the previous quote is that the superior acupuncturists, those who know how to use the needles well, they treat yang from yin, yin from yang, or they lead yang from yin and yin from yang. So we can also look at other connections where these different layers have a resonance with one another. So for example, in the 6th chapter of the Suen, it says the Tai Yang, the greater yang channel, is the opening, where the greater yang layer is the opening. The Yang Ming is the closing. That's the yang brilliance. And the Xiao Yang, the lesser yang, is the pivot. What exactly is opening and closing and pivoting is a much bigger story that you can come to the New York area. We can go to dim sum and drink tea and discuss that. But for now, just understand that there are these different aspects of qi within the body that have different function. On the yin layer, we also see that the Tai Yin is the open, that's the lesser yin. The Jue Yin, the reverting yin, is the close, and the Xiao Yin, the smaller yin, is the pivot. So there is also a resonance between these yang and yin layers of the body that we can then express through the mechanism of the channels. So here we have the greater yang that has a resonance with the lesser yin, sorry, scratch that, go back. We have the greater yang, which has a resonance with the greater yin. The lesser yang, the Xiao Yang, has a resonance with the Xiao Yin, the lesser yin. And then the yang brilliance has a resonance with the reverting yin. So here, I think I said that, I think I messed it up. I haven't had enough tea yet this morning. Anyway, despite what I said here, you can see in the chart, the resonance, we have a Tai Yang and Tai Yin have resonance, Xia Yang and Xiao Yin have resonance, Yang Ming and Jue Yin have resonance because they have similar functions. My apologies for messing that up in the oral presentation. What we see then here is that there are these channels that then have connections with one another. So the small intestine and spleen go together, the lung and bladder go together, sanjiao and kidney, heart and gallbladder, large intestine and liver and pericardium and stomach. This is where the presentation gets a little more technical. So what do we see here then in terms of how do we actually treat the patient? So since we know that the area we need to treat is this area of the arm, the channels we need to deal with are those channels of the Yang Ming, the greater Yang, sorry, the Yang brilliance, and the Tai Yang, the greater Yang. Then these are the points that we come up with for treatment. The first point here, we needle on the opposite side near the knee. The first point here is the upper of the 4 flowers, which for those of you who do acupuncture, know this more commonly by the conventional acupuncture point name of leg 3 miles. This is just down from the knee. So this 7.08, that's where it's located. Just down from the knee on the Yang Ming channel, on the Yang brilliance channel, which then has a connection to the Yang Ming on the arm. The second point we used was this one here called, we'll come back to that. Second one we used here was this one called Tianhuang, Heavenly Emperor, which overlaps Yin Mound Spring, spleen 9, right? So this is on the inside of the leg, just down from the knee. Here it's 7.17, right? This is on the lesser Yin channel, which has a connection to the greater Yang channel. Or sorry, the greater Yin channel has a connection to the greater Yang channel, right? So here we had the problem on the arm is on the Taiyang, the greater Yang. So here we chose the Taiyin, the greater Yin, to treat that as a corresponding channel. So what happens is these needles go on the opposite leg, 2 needles. The needles are put in place and just gently twirled. We don't go for strong needle stimulation. We don't do supplementing and draining needle, for those of you who know what that is. And at the same time, the patient just gently moves the arm. To increase circulation in the arm in general, we also placed one point, this is called Lingu, which is on the hand near Hegu, large intestine 4, simply to open up circulation globally through that arm. 3 needles, no local points, and by the end of 30 or so minutes needle retention, not only is the pain almost entirely gone, but the swelling is also visibly abated, right? So there's no longer any swelling at the end of that treatment at the same time. Now, another thing that's interesting that I'll just point out briefly is that we had pain and a sense of hotness to the touch, or there is heat to the touch. So one of the other things we can think about is how can I use needles in the treatment of this other aspect, this heat aspect on the arm. If we go back to this point, the upper 4 flowers, which is stomach 36, and this will be a bit more sort of technical as well in the understanding of how the channels interact with one another. Stomach 36 is the soil point or the earth point on the stomach channel, which is the earth or soil channel. So this is what's called the bun, the origin or the horary point of the channel, which means it is the same of the 5 phase associations as the channel is. So this point has a very soil or very earth nature. If we look at the interrelationship of the 5 phases, we know that the earth or the soil is the child of fire. Okay, so this has to do with the different interaction between the in terms of heat. The other reason we chose this point was because earth or soil as the child of fire has a draining effect on fire. So if we want to cool off that area, one of the things we can do is use earth on earth, and it happens to be in the same resonant position on arm and leg, to have a cooling effect on the area of dysfunction as well. Okay? And lo and behold, by the end of those 30 or 40 minutes of the needle retention, not only is the swelling visibly gone, but the arm is no longer hot to the touch. We get the idea there? That's a bit more of a sort of theoretical discussion for those of you who don't know 5-phase theory so well. Just park that in the back of your head and come back and watch the presentation and recording later. Okay. The last thing I'll sort of talk about, which I think is particularly interesting about Tung's acupuncture, most of you who practice acupuncture know that the conventional model of acupuncture is that we do different types of needle techniques to either supplement or drain a point. And here I'd like to give you, as you can tell, inspirational quotes from non-medical texts as well. This is from the Lao Tzu, the Tao Te Ching. This is chapter 77. It says, "Is not the Tao of heaven just like drawing a bow? The high is lowered and that which is low is made higher. reduce where there is superabundance and supplement insufficiency. The Tao of heaven is to reduce superabundance and supplement insufficiency. So, in other words, the universe, the Tao, everything ideally is a self-correcting mechanism, right? Everything likes ideally to seek a state of balance. When we have patients as physicians who come to us, the reason they come to us is because for some reason their body is in a state of not doing its normal job of seeking homeostasis and balance on its own, which is what's supposed to happen. That also means that when we're doing needling, we don't have to push my will on the patient in order for the patient to get good effect from the needling. One of the things I tell my students all the time in the clinic is that at some point as the clinician, I have to get out of my own way and let the patient's body start the process of seeking for balance by itself, looking for homeostasis by itself. It's not me superimposing my will on the patient's body, but rather creating the conditions in that patient's body so that it is going back to the balance, which is its normal state. Okay. The method of medicine works well enough without me having to superimpose me in the process. I have to understand the general ways that I can push the patient's body back into a state of balance, but if I have to rely on my intuition, if I have to rely on my hand technique, then, what if it's a bad day and my intuition is off, or maybe I'm too tired? If the method works, then the needles normally and naturally will allow the body to look for that balance by itself. So in many ways, there's no need to force certain needle technique methods. We just choose the right points and the body will respond resonantly by itself. Okay, I think I've chatted enough for a little while. We only have a couple minutes left, so why don't I open the floor to some questions if we want, or if there are other words from our sponsors, we can go back to you guys as well.
We usually just have folks put questions in the chat here and read them off just so that we can have them on the recording as well.
Sure.
One question I do have before people jump in is what is the reason for these like kind of other nomenclature for the points? I see like a 77, 17, these.
Yeah. So the
acupuncture channels the same way, or are they fundamentally different channels?
Right. That is a existential question that the answer to is, like many things, both. So there is a channel concept within Tung's acupuncture that to some extent even calls into question what is the very nature of a channel, where Tung's acupuncture sometimes sees point as channel as almost synonymous, or point groups as channel as synonymous. But yet, if the channels of Chinese medicine exist as they do, then they exist no matter the language we use to describe them, right? So keep in mind that the modern uniformity of point names is, in some cases, a modern uniformity, where the state of China has decided these are the official names. But even in English translation, we can see book after book that gives alternate names for different acupuncture points. So the names have varied depending on the source and tradition. Maybe some of the big heavy hitters have been more consistent, but sometimes the names of points have not been consistent from lineage to lineage throughout all of the last 2,000 years, right? Even the location of points on what channel they are today, some of the points in the head and neck area have varied over time into which channel they pertain to, right? So things do change. The numbering system in Tung's acupuncture is a modern innovation that was created for those of us who don't speak an Asian language as our primary language. Like all acupuncture systems, initially there wasn't a numbering system. We opened the Neijing, Zusanli, leg 3 miles, was not stomach number 36, it was just Zusanli, right? So in Tung's acupuncture, before really the 1980s or 1990s, there were no numbers. Numbers were added in to help sort of categorize and catalog the system. So my suggestion is don't get hung up on the numbers. Honestly, as a teacher, I know very few of them in my head because they don't actually have that much meaning, right? What exactly the numbers refer to is a bigger story. The first part of it refers to the part of the body the point is on, and the second one is just sort of random association with how they show up in a text. Yeah.
Okay, right on. No, that's good to remember to not get hung up on it. The second question is, why no strong stimulation? Why only place the needle, retain? Is there a specific reason for that? Is that related to your last quote on we're not superimposing a will into the
Yeah.
needle?
You
Or
know, so when Master Dong was practicing in Taiwan, they all used pretty thick needles because everyone did, right? So I can't say that the lack of strong stimulation is something that's uniform through all Dong practitioners. The lack of supplementing and draining needle is uniform. Master Dong did not do draining and supplementing needle. And he was not the only person. You know, my own grand teacher from the New England School of Acupuncture, Dr. So, basically thought it was unnecessary. The needles basically do what the needles do. You put the stimulus into the system. And I would argue, reading texts like the Nanjing, the Classic of Difficulties, even the Classic of Difficulties argues that needle technique is less important than point selection, right? So I think point selection is always first and foremost in what we're doing. I was also trained, for those of you who know what Toyohari is, I was also trained in Japanese forms of acupuncture where stimulus is very light. And in my own clinic, I will do sometimes non-insertive needling, even though I practice mostly Chinese acupuncture. So I know from practical experience that we don't have to get strong stimulus in order to get effect. And I would also argue that the only one chapter in the Neijing that talks about de qi, the obtaining the qi, has nothing to do with needle sensation. The only description of de qi in the Neijing has to do with the sort of entire atmosphere of needling, the appropriateness of the practitioner, the mindset of the patient, the basically patient-doctor relationship. This is how the early classical texts define de qi. I think the idea that it has to be strong stimulus is a preference and not actual, it's a cultural preference and not actually a requirement, clearly, because otherwise a significant portion of the world's acupuncturists would get no effect, which we know is not happening.
yeah, it's really interesting that it wasn't in the classics in referencing the needle technique, because so much of what we learn in school and the needle technique, you can go back to the classics and pick out that's the exact chapter where we're looking at this sort of idea, whereas De Qi has not historically been, and it would make sense because they were using much thicker needles at the time of so
Right.
they probably wouldn't be emphasizing, hey, you really need to get them to feel it. The patient would be, running off the table if they were doing some of the things we could do now.
Exactly. The initial chapter of the Suen, and the number of the chapters out of my head, it's in the 20s somewhere, maybe 24 of the Suen, that is the first chapter that gives us a manipulation of qi with a needle where it talks about supplementing and draining, talks about opening and closing the hole and breathing. It doesn't talk about lifting, thrusting, and twirling. So for me, as a practitioner, I mean, I came to Chinese medicine through practicing meditation, qigong, that sort of stuff. For me, where breath and body becomes so important to cultivation, it makes sense that even with needling, that is an important aspect of it. Where it's later texts, like medieval Chinese texts, that go more heavily into needle technique. It's not that it's not there historically. It's just that detailed description of needle technique that we learn today in contemporary Chinese medicine is not in the classical texts, if we define classical texts as being those texts from the Han period, right? We see it again in medieval texts, but we don't necessarily see it in the Neijing. It's definitely not in the Nanjing. Nanjing doesn't talk, but Nanjing really is all about point selection based on 5-phase concepts. So it's how do we utilize these theories of interconnectedness with the universe that then do supplementing and draining and not what we do with the needle per se, right? Which I find clinically more useful, to be honest. After 26 years of practice, that's what I use, and I do it every day. I did it on 70 patients last week, and it seems to work okay. So, good. Are there, other questions? So again, hopefully this discussion was technical enough for those who practice Chinese medicine to pique your interest or your thought, but hopefully not so technical that if you don't practice Chinese medicine, you can't make use of it as well. But I hope that we gave sort of at least a look at one way of expressing some of these very important ideas and how it's used in, again, I'm not a Taoist scholar. I'm not a priest. I just go to my office every day, and that's my meditation. My meditation is this. My meditation is, what do I see in front of me with my patients, and how can I make myself a clear channel for these concepts rather than superimposing my will on that process. So
Yeah, no, this was awesome. Well, I think obviously there's a technical component that we really exactly. Lewis said in the chat, not just. So that's a very important point. And it's you went into the technical for the acupuncturist, and I hope that the non-acupuncturists and non-medicine people can really take some of these concepts of correspondences within the body as a global theme, but also some of the specifics. If you practice Tai Chi Chuan, you probably have heard of the external harmonies, and they're the same things we're using in medicine. And I remember working with some of these ideas within, when I was doing acupuncture on, athletes and working with teams. And yeah, if somebody has a problem with hip extension, they're going to have shoulder extension issues because it's just how we walk. If the yang ming stung channel at the hip is restricted, the yang large intestine at the shoulder is going to be restricted. It's just, you're going to balance out the body that way. The body has a really intuitive way of adding tension or taking it away based on how the rest of the system is working. We don't work as an isolated unit. And so I think this conversation, this discussion, this presentation is very applicable to everyone. And of course, you can take this into a more psychosomatic lens as well, as far as correspondence, resonance, and connection. So thank you, Henry.
thank you.
Yeah, thank you for being here.
And thank you all for sponsors for having me. I really, as you can tell, I like to hear myself talk sometimes, and so I enjoy coming in and talking to people. And thank you for all of those of you here who are really incredible scholars who are adding to the understanding of all of these wonderful sort of systems within the English language. You're all very much appreciated, and even if I haven't met some of you in person, I've read your books and know that well, so I appreciate that as well. So thank you.
Yeah, that's exactly the sentiment we want to echo from DaoistGate, is that we really appreciate these people bringing in these wisdom traditions, upholding them, bringing them authentically to our audience, to people in the Western world in an authentic way, because Lord knows they're needed. And so with that, I think we're going to take a little 15-minute break. We're going to come back at the East Coast time would be 11:45, when Dr. Dali Yang is going to take us through some medieval Chinese exercises and their therapeutic use, some history and perhaps some practice. So you don't want to miss that. So let's come back in 13 minutes now, and I'll see you all in a moment. Thank you for being here.